When the first faint glimmers of dawn touched the limestone cliffs above the ancient valley, where tribes who had no names for themselves once gathered around fires that flickered like restless spirits, a peculiar idea stirred among them, an idea neither spoken nor fully formed, yet destined to shape every century ahead. It was the question that would haunt kings and monks, explorers and philosophers, emperors and heretics alike. What exactly is this strange inner light that wakes behind the eyes and whispers, "I am here"? Long before the word consciousness existed, before clay tablets recorded myths or astronomers studied the sky, early humans sensed a mysterious presence within themselves, something as elusive as mist, yet as undeniable as hunger, urging them to carve symbols, to bury their dead with care, to paint visions on cave walls that pulsed with uncanny life in the wavering firelight. 1,000 winters passed across continents where mammoths roamed and glaciers shifted, and the buried seeds of self-awareness sprouted in the quiet minds of those long-gone ancestors. Their shamans whispered to the darkness that the mind was a traveler slipping between worlds, stepping beyond bodies as effortlessly as shadows lengthened at dusk, believing that dreams were journeys where one could meet ancestors, gods, or the hidden corners of one's own spirit, though they didn't yet understand that such journeys originated within the corridors of the brain. As the great river civilizations emerged, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the earliest written attempts to grasp this inner dimension appeared. In the dim lamplight of a Mesopotamian scribe's workshop, where reed pans scratched softly against damp clay, consciousness was imagined as a delicate bird that escaped the body at death, liberated from its cage of flesh. Meanwhile, in Egypt, priests in crisp linen robes traced hieroglyphs that suggested the Ka, a kind of vital essence that lived in the blood, breath, and heartbeat, while the Ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird, embodied personality and mobility, drifting from the body at night as dreams shimmered through the sleeping mind. Though these early models were metaphors, they revealed an extraordinary leap. Ancient civilizations had recognized that the self was not identical to the body, that some internal force, call it soul, spirit, psyche, hovered at the center of human existence. Traveling eastward across dusty trade routes, where caravans carried lapis lazuli and silk long before empires rose or fell, one would find in the early Vedic traditions of India an astonishingly intricate exploration of consciousness. Mystics, seated beneath banyan trees, immersed themselves in meditation so profound that their breathing nearly ceased, entering a state they called Turiya, a realm beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, where awareness revealed itself as pure existence. The Upanishads described consciousness as the foundation of reality, a cosmic ocean from which all forms emerged. This wasn't mere speculation. It was born of disciplined introspection as rigorous as any laboratory experiment, where practitioners charted the subtle shifts of their minds with precision honed over centuries. From this tradition blossomed the concept of Atman, a timeless inner self, and Brahman, the universal consciousness, ideas that would echo across millennia and eventually captivate Western thinkers frustrated by the limitations of their own frameworks. To the north, the early Greeks examined consciousness with a different lens, forged by debate, logic, and observation. Pythagoras, wandering with his disciples through the olive-lined roads of southern Italy, taught that the soul was immortal and harmonically structured like the universe. Heraclitus, speaking in riddles by the smoldering hearths of Ephesus, insisted that the psyche was a flickering flame sustained by the breath, ever-changing yet continuous. But it was Plato, in the shaded colonnades of the Academy, who declared that the soul was tripartite, reason ruling from the head, spirit burning in the chest, and appetite residing in the belly. To him, consciousness was a remembering of truths glimpsed before birth, a recollection so faint that only through discipline and philosophical struggle could one illuminate it again. Aristotle, in contrast, grounded consciousness in the physical world, suggesting that sensation was inseparable from perception and that memory required a material substrate. Though many of Aristotle's theories would be overturned, his idea that the mind must be studied as part of the living body foreshadowed the neuroscientific revolutions to come. While Greek debates echoed across the Mediterranean, in China, scholars under the Zhou dynasty composed the earliest treatises on the Xin, the heart-mind, conceived not as a duality, but a unified seat of cognition, emotion, and moral intuition. Taoist sages sought states of consciousness so tranquil that the boundary between observer and world dissolved, like mist merging with a river at dawn. They described experiences of Wu Wei, effortless action arising when consciousness flowed without resistance, and spoke of a hidden clarity that emerged when one stilled the turbulence of thought. Far from abstract musings, these ideas shaped disciplines like Qigong and internal martial arts, where practitioners learned to cultivate awareness not merely of thoughts, but of subtle bodily sensations, breath rhythms, and the energetic undercurrents they believed pervaded all things. Centuries passed, carrying with them empires, languages, and philosophies that layered upon one another like geological strata. The Romans, pragmatic and disciplined, paid little attention to consciousness beyond the legal and moral dimensions of personhood. Yet their physicians quietly advanced anatomical knowledge that would later prove essential. Galen, dissecting the bodies of gladiators in shadowed chambers lit by bronze lamps, meticulously traced nerves, distinguishing sensory from motor pathways, and argued that mental life must somehow arise from the brain's intricately folded tissues. His writings, copied and recopied by monastic scribes through times of war and plague, provided a fragile bridge to future scientific inquiry. In another part of the world, Islamic scholars of the Golden Age carried the torch of intellectual curiosity with astonishing brilliance. In the bustling libraries of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, where translators rendered Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna crafted elaborate models of the intellect. Avicenna, writing in elegant prose that blended philosophy with early psychology, described levels of inner experience so finely differentiated that modern theorists of consciousness still cite his work with admiration. He proposed that the human mind possessed a floating man thought experiment. If a person were suspended in air, deprived of all sensory contact, he would still possess an awareness of his own existence. This was perhaps the earliest articulation of self-awareness independent of the body, a precursor to contemporary thought experiments in cognitive science. Meanwhile, in the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks illuminated manuscripts with golden inks while quietly reflecting on the nature of the soul. Their interest was spiritual rather than psychological, yet their introspective diaries captured detailed inner experiences, visions, temptations, doubts that revealed the depths of conscious thought long before modern psychology. Mystical traditions, from Hildegard of Bingen to Meister Eckhart, described states of consciousness so intense that they bordered on transcendence, blurring the line between theology and phenomenology. When the Renaissance dawned, accompanied by the scent of pigment in Florentine workshops and the rustle of parchment in newly flourishing universities, consciousness became a subject ripe for radical reinterpretation. Descartes, gazing into the fireplace on a winter night while pondering the nature of certainty, declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, a proclamation that elevated consciousness to the very foundation of existence. Yet his strict mind-body separation would both inspire and frustrate generations of scientists, for while it placed consciousness at the center of philosophy, it trapped it within an invisible realm seemingly unreachable by empirical tools. But others sought evidence in flesh rather than metaphysics. Vesalius, the renegade anatomist, peeled away layers of tissue to map the true structure of the nervous system, revealing the complexity of the brain with precision unmatched for centuries. The 17th century crackled with discoveries. Microscope lenses revealed tiny nerve fibers. Early physiologists stimulated frog muscles with sparks, wondering if the body ran on invisible currents. Philosophers debated whether animals possessed consciousness or were merely complex machines. Every idea tugged at the same persistent question that had followed humanity since the dawn fires of prehistory. What exactly is this inner spark that watches the world unfold? As Europe entered the Enlightenment, scientific salons filled with heated discussions about memory, attention, sensation, and imagination. John Locke argued that consciousness was the thread that stitched moments of personal identity together, while Hume insisted that no such coherent self existed, only a loose bundle of perceptions flickering across the mind like reflections on a rippling lake. Meanwhile, in far-off Edo period Japan, Scholars of the Kokugaku movement composed treatises on kokoro, the inner heart-mind, blending Shinto, Confucian, and Buddhist principles into sophisticated reflections on subjective experience. Then came the 19th century, when the world was transformed by gas-lit streets, steam engines, and surgical breakthroughs that for the first time allowed researchers to probe the living brain with unprecedented precision. Phineas Gage's accident, in which a metal tamping rod blasted through his skull, shocked Victorian society, not merely because he survived, but because his personality, his consciousness, was altered so dramatically that doctors began to suspect that the mind was not a single unified entity, but a constellation of functions dependent on specific neural regions. Broca and Wernicke mapped language processing to distinct cortical areas, while Charcot hypnotized patients in the Salpêtrière Hospital, revealing the malleability of consciousness through suggestion. William James, writing with poetic clarity, described consciousness as a stream rather than a static object, an ever-changing flow of thoughts, perceptions, and feelings that could only be understood dynamically, never frozen into isolated snapshots. As the century turned and electricity illuminated cities around the world, new technologies propelled the study of consciousness forward. Electroencephalography captured the brain's rhythmic electrical patterns, revealing deep sleep stages and dream states with startling clarity. Freud constructed elaborate theories about the unconscious, proposing that much of the mind's activity lay hidden beneath awareness, like the submerged base of an iceberg. Though many of Freud's claims would later be challenged or discarded, his insistence that consciousness was only a small window into a much larger psychological landscape forever changed how people understood themselves. As laboratories multiplied across continents, and the early 20th century unfolded with a peculiar mix of optimism and dread, consciousness research entered a new phase shaped by the tremors of modernity. In quiet rooms lit by the soft glow of tungsten lamps, scientists like Santiago Ramón y Cajal traced neurons with almost monastic devotion, sketching their branching forms with such precision that each drawing resembled an ancient tree growing inside the skull. His insistence that neurons were discrete cells rather than a continuous web shattered old assumptions and opened the door to a profound realization. Consciousness was not the whisper of a single organ, but an emergent chorus of billions of interconnected elements, each firing in patterns more complex than the constellations charted by ancient astronomers. As Cajal's silver-stained neurons spread through textbooks, it became clear that the mind's inner workings were no longer the exclusive domain of philosophers. Biologists now held the keys to its hidden chambers. But just as these discoveries gained momentum, the world convulsed with wars that reshaped everything from borders to beliefs. Soldiers returned from the trenches with wounds no surgeon could see. drifting through cities in ghostly silence, their minds fractured by horrors too vast to name. Psychiatrists observing these men spoke of shell shock, and though their terminology was crude, their insights were pivotal. Consciousness could be shattered without any visible injury, revealing that its stability depended on fragile psychological mechanisms constantly negotiating between memory, emotion, and perception. As these broken minds haunted hospital wards, researchers realized that consciousness was neither fixed nor guaranteed. It trembled on tenuous foundations, vulnerable to trauma, disease, and even the quiet erosion of time. Across the Atlantic, behaviorism rose with evangelical zeal, sweeping through universities like a tide determined to drown introspection forever. Watson and later Skinner argued with unyielding certainty that consciousness was not a suitable object for scientific study at all, dismissing inner experience as a private theater irrelevant to the measurable world. They observed rats navigating mazes and pigeons pecking at colored discs, convinced that behavior alone could explain the mind's workings without invoking mysterious notions like awareness. For decades, this movement dominated psychological thought, silencing centuries of philosophical inquiry as though consciousness were nothing more than an inconvenient superstition. Yet beneath the surface, dissent simmered. Some scholars refused to surrender the richness of subjective experience to the stark simplicity of stimulus and response. The seeds of cognitive science began germinating in the background, waiting for the intellectual climate to shift. That shift came in the mid-20th century, when new technologies and new metaphors reshaped the landscape once again. The invention of the computer provided a fresh conceptual model of the mind, not a mystical soul, not a bundle of perceptions, not a mere byproduct of behavior, but an information processing system capable of storing, retrieving, and manipulating symbols. This metaphor, though imperfect, ignited a revolution. Researchers like Turing speculated about machine intelligence, while others probed memory, perception, and attention with renewed rigor. No longer was consciousness banished from the scientific stage. It reemerged transformed, now cast as an emergent property of computational complexity. Meanwhile, cyberneticians and early neuroscientists mapped feedback loops in both machines and organisms, revealing that systems capable of self-regulation and adaptation exhibited rudimentary forms of awareness. These insights nudged consciousness closer to the realm of physics and engineering, dissolving old boundaries with unexpected boldness. As the century progressed, brain imaging technologies arrived like gifts from the future. PET scans, then fMRI machines, began to illuminate the living brain with colors that glowed against the void like shifting nebulae. For the first time in history, scientists could watch consciousness unfold moment by moment, tracing how attention migrated across neural circuits, how emotions surged and faded, how memories spark to life in the hippocampus before dissipating again. Monks trained in meditation entered these scanners and revealed neural signatures of states previously accessible only through poetic description. Patients in vegetative states displayed faint but undeniable flickers of awareness, prompting ethical debates that rippled through hospitals and courtrooms. Each discovery added a new layer to the ever-expanding mosaic of consciousness, unveiling patterns more intricate than the spinning stars of a medieval astrolabe. Yet with every breakthrough came new mysteries: the binding problem, the question of how the brain integrates color, shape, motion, sound, and meaning into a unified experience, challenged researchers to confront the limits of current theories. Neural oscillations in the gamma frequency appeared to synchronize disparate brain regions during moments of attention, hinting at mechanisms for unity. Yet no single answer satisfied the complexity of the phenomenon. Meanwhile, philosophers like Thomas Nagel asked what it meant to know what it is like to be something, emphasizing that subjective experience, qualia, could not be reduced to firing patterns alone. His famous question about what it is like to be a bat haunted neuroscience labs, reminding researchers that consciousness was not merely computation or integration, but an inner world accessible only to the experiencer. David Chalmers escalated this challenge by introducing the hard problem, insisting that even a complete map of neural processes could not explain why those processes felt like anything from the inside. The debate ignited conferences, books, and late-night arguments in university corridors as scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians wrestled with the question that no epoch had ever quite answered. Meanwhile, in the world of medicine, anesthesiologists explored the depths of unconsciousness with precision that echoed the explorations of ancient shamans, but grounded in chemistry rather than ritual. They discovered that consciousness could be turned off in layers, not like a switch, but like a complex dimming of lights across multiple neural networks. Some drugs silenced the thalamus, others disrupted cortical connectivity, and still others induced amnesia while leaving awareness intact. The revelation that consciousness had multiple components: arousal, awareness, memory, selfhood, reshaped both theory and practice, revealing that losing consciousness could mean many different things depending on which systems faltered. In operating rooms around the world, machines hummed softly while anesthetic vapors flowed, and for the first time in history, the act of slipping into unconsciousness became one of the most meticulously studied transitions in human existence. At the same time, studies of dreaming revealed states of consciousness that defied traditional categories. REM sleep, with its rapid eye movements and vivid imagery, showed neural activity akin to wakefulness despite the body lying motionless. Lucid dreamers trained to signal their awareness through subtle eye movements inside the dream world, allowing scientists to measure conscious intention occurring entirely within imagination. These experiments blurred the distinction between inner and outer reality, suggesting that consciousness could operate with remarkable autonomy, creating entire worlds as convincing as waking life. Ancient traditions had long claimed that the mind possessed such powers, but now neuroscientists measured them with electrodes and imaging tools, tracing the boundary between self-generated experience and perception of the external world with newfound clarity. As research on dreaming expanded, another frontier opened in the study of altered states, drawing scientists toward phenomena that earlier centuries dismissed as superstition or intoxicated fantasy. Psychedelic compounds, once relegated to the margins of anthropology and counterculture, re-emerged in sterile laboratory settings where volunteers lay under scanners while their brains bloomed with kaleidoscopic activity. Substances like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT dissolved the rigid hierarchies of neural signaling, allowing distant regions of the cortex to communicate in patterns rarely seen in ordinary wakefulness. Participants described visions of fractal landscapes, encounters with beings woven from light, and the dissolution of the ego, experiences that echoed ancient shamanic traditions from the Amazon to Siberia. But now these states were measurable. Functional connectivity maps revealed networks expanding and merging like rivers in flood, while the default mode network, associated with the narrative sense of self, grew quiet, as if stepping aside to let other forms of consciousness speak. Researchers did not rush toward mystical conclusions, yet they acknowledged that these altered states offered a rare window into the machinery of perception, identity, and reality formation. The boundaries of consciousness proved porous, shifting with chemistry, rhythm, suggestion, and intention. At the same time, technological experiments reached further into the neural depths once considered unreachable. Direct brain stimulation, once a crude technique reserved for treating severe epilepsy, evolved into precise tools capable of awakening dormant memories, generating phosphenes, or even eliciting emotional states with a mere electrical pulse. A patient undergoing neurosurgery for Parkinson's disease might suddenly laugh when a specific region was stimulated, though she could not explain why. Or another might recall a childhood scent after a surgeon brushed an electrode against the hippocampus. These strange responses revealed that consciousness was not an indivisible entity, but a mosaic of interconnected processes that could be activated or silenced like instruments in a vast orchestra. And though such interventions were conducted with caution, they quietly transformed humanity's relationship to its own mind, demonstrating that identity itself could be modulated, deliberately or inadvertently, through contact with the brain's intricate architecture.
Meanwhile, computational neuroscientists built intricate models attempting to simulate conscious processes, constructing virtual agents capable of learning, planning, and adapting. Some models used predictive coding frameworks, proposing that the brain constantly generated internal predictions about the world and updated them based on incoming sensory data. According to this view, consciousness arose from the interplay between expectation and error correction, a perpetual dialogue between internal models and external reality. This perspective cast perception not as passive reception, but as active inference, where the brain sculpted experience by predicting what should occur and highlighting the surprising or anomalous. Every sound, sight, or thought became a negotiation between what was anticipated and what was observed, suggesting that consciousness was not a mirror reflecting reality, but an artist interpreting it through layers of expectation. As predictive processing reshaped theories of perception and cognition, another frontier emerged in the exploration of consciousness, the study of embodied experience. For centuries, thinkers had treated the mind as though it floated above the body, a detached observer gazing out through the senses. But research in the early 21st century revealed that consciousness was not confined to the brain. It extended through muscles, skin, organs, and even into the environments bodies interacted with. Experiments in embodied cognition demonstrated that posture influenced emotion, gesture shaped thought, and physical movement altered memory recall. When subjects held warm cups, they rated strangers as more trustworthy. When they leaned slightly forward, they predicted events with greater optimism. When they gestured expansively, they solved puzzles more creatively. Such findings suggested that consciousness was not an abstract computation, but a lived process, intertwined with flesh and world. Echoing ancient observations from yoga, martial arts, and dance traditions in cultures separated by oceans, yet united by an intuitive understanding that awareness flowed through the entire organism. In parallel, the study of interoception, awareness of internal bodily states, revealed surprising depths. The heartbeat, long dismissed as mere physiological rhythm, emerged as a potent modulator of conscious experience. Individuals with heightened sensitivity to their pulse tended to experience emotions more intensely, make bolder decisions, and detect subtle social cues that others missed. Breathing, too, shaped awareness. Slow exhalations calmed neural firing in limbic circuits, while rapid breaths heightened vigilance and sharpened sensory perception. Researchers discovered that the insular cortex, once a neglected fold deep within the brain, functioned as a hub where bodily sensations became part of conscious awareness. This discovery bridged neuroscience with ancient contemplative practices that had emphasized breath, heartbeat, and bodily stillness as gateways to deeper levels of consciousness. The past and the present intertwined, revealing that millennia-old insights carried scientific wisdom unrecognized until tools matured enough to detect them. Meanwhile, computational neuroscientists built intricate models attempting to simulate conscious processes, constructing virtual agents capable of learning, planning, and adapting. Some models used predictive coding frameworks, proposing that the brain constantly generated internal predictions about the world and updated them based on incoming sensory data. According to this view, consciousness arose from the interplay between expectation and error correction, a perpetual dialogue between internal models and external reality. This perspective cast perception not as passive reception, but as active inference, where the brain sculpted experience by predicting what should occur and highlighting the surprising or anomalous. Every sound, sight, or thought became a negotiation between what was anticipated and what was observed, suggesting that consciousness was not a mirror reflecting reality, but an artist interpreting it through layers of expectation. As predictive processing reshaped theories of perception and cognition, another frontier emerged in the exploration of consciousness, the study of embodied experience. For centuries, thinkers had treated the mind as though it floated above the body, a detached observer gazing out through the senses. But research in the early 21st century revealed that consciousness was not confined to the brain. It extended through muscles, skin, organs, and even into the environments bodies interacted with. Experiments in embodied cognition demonstrated that posture influenced emotion, gesture shaped thought, and physical movement altered memory recall. When subjects held warm cups, they rated strangers as more trustworthy. When they leaned slightly forward, they predicted events with greater optimism. When they gestured expansively, they solved puzzles more creatively. Such findings suggested that consciousness was not an abstract computation, but a lived process, intertwined with flesh and world. Echoing ancient observations from yoga, martial arts, and dance traditions in cultures separated by oceans, yet united by an intuitive understanding that awareness flowed through the entire organism. In parallel, the study of interoception, awareness of internal bodily states, revealed surprising depths. The heartbeat, long dismissed as mere physiological rhythm, emerged as a potent modulator of conscious experience. Individuals with heightened sensitivity to their pulse tended to experience emotions more intensely, make bolder decisions, and detect subtle social cues that others missed. Breathing, too, shaped awareness. Slow exhalations calmed neural firing in limbic circuits, while rapid breaths heightened vigilance and sharpened sensory perception. Researchers discovered that the insular cortex, once a neglected fold deep within the brain, functioned as a hub where bodily sensations became part of conscious awareness. This discovery bridged neuroscience with ancient contemplative practices that had emphasized breath, heartbeat, and bodily stillness as gateways to deeper levels of consciousness. The past and the present intertwined, revealing that millennia-old insights carried scientific wisdom unrecognized until tools matured enough to detect them.
As understanding of conscious states grew richer, new questions emerged about the boundaries of selfhood. Experiments using virtual reality allowed researchers to manipulate the sense of body ownership, placing participants in the perspectives of avatars, or shifting visual and tactile cues until individuals felt located within bodies not their own. Some participants reported experiencing the world from behind their virtual avatars. Others felt elongated limbs or entirely different body shapes as natural extensions of themselves. A particularly striking experiment immersed participants in a simulation of an embodied humanoid figure facing a mirror. Within minutes, many reported that the reflected virtual body felt like their own, despite knowing consciously that it was artificial. These illusions demonstrated that the sense of self, often regarded as the bedrock of consciousness, was surprisingly malleable. What people perceived as I could expand, contract, or shift with astonishing ease under the right conditions, revealing that selfhood was a construct emerging from multisensory integration rather than a fixed entity. As virtual worlds grew more sophisticated, individuals began spending increasing amounts of time in simulated environments where consciousness adapted to new rules, new identities, and new modes of interaction. Gamers described entering flow states so immersive that virtual landscapes felt more vivid than physical ones. Social platforms allowed users to develop identities untethered from physical constraints. Experimental augmented reality systems blended digital information with physical perception until distinctions blurred like ink in water. These developments raised profound questions. If consciousness adapted effortlessly to new forms of embodiment and perception, what anchored its continuity? Where lay the core self, if indeed such a core existed at all? Or was continuity merely a narrative woven by memory to maintain coherence amid constant change? Evolutionary biologists approached the question from yet another angle, examining consciousness through the lens of natural selection. They proposed that awareness emerged not as a metaphysical gift, but as an adaptive tool for navigating uncertain environments. The ability to imagine future scenarios, infer others' intentions, and reflect on past mistakes provided survival advantages in complex ecosystems. Social species, in particular, benefited from heightened awareness. Cooperation, deception, empathy, and alliance building required sensitivity to internal and external cues. Over millions of years, neural networks expanded, integrating sensory information with emotional signals and forming predictive models of the world. Consciousness, in this view, was a biological strategy, a way of compressing vast streams of data into coherent narratives that guided adaptive behavior. Yet, even in this evolutionary framework, mysteries persisted. Why should such neural complexity produce subjective experience at all? Why should pain feel painful or beauty feel beautiful if mere computation would suffice for decision-making? Evolution could explain the function of consciousness, but not its phenomenological qualities.
As debates intensified, quantum theorists entered the arena with models that sparked both fascination and controversy. Some proposed that consciousness might arise from quantum processes within microtubules,
tiny structures inside neurons, suggesting that awareness was tied not to classical computation, but to quantum coherence. Critics dismissed these ideas as speculative, yet the proposals revived ancient philosophical questions about the relationship between mind and matter. Could consciousness be a fundamental property of the universe, woven into the fabric of reality like space and time? Or was it purely demergent, a byproduct of billions of interconnected cells firing in precise patterns? The question resembled the dilemmas faced by early philosophers gazing at the night sky, wondering whether the stars were gods or simply burning spheres of gas far beyond reach. Anthropologists studying remote cultures contributed yet more dimensions to the evolving picture. Among the San storytellers of southern Africa, consciousness interwove with dreams that guided hunts and shaped tribal decisions. Among the Maori, the concept of wairua linked consciousness to ancestry and land. Among indigenous groups in the Amazon, ayahuasca visions were considered portals revealing layers of reality inaccessible in ordinary states. These worldviews, though varied, shared a common insight. Consciousness was not confined to individual minds, but extended into relationships, ecosystems, and spiritual lineages. Even if not literally adopted by science, such perspectives challenged researchers to consider whether Western notions of consciousness were overly narrow, shaped by cultural biases that ignored forms of awareness outside analytic frameworks. In hospitals around the world, neurologists encountered consciousness at its most fragile in patients suffering from degenerative diseases. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia, and other disorders gradually eroded memory, language, and identity, revealing how consciousness unraveled thread by thread. Families witnessed their loved ones shift from vibrant storytellers to quiet observers, then to individuals unable to recognize their own reflections. Neuroscientists mapping these trajectories discovered that consciousness was not a single entity, but a compilation of cognitive faculties: episodic memory, semantic understanding, emotional regulation, executive function, each depending on distinct neural circuits. As these circuits deteriorated, consciousness transformed in incremental steps, offering heartbreaking but invaluable insight into the architecture of awareness. Even in late stages of dementia, however, moments of clarity sometimes appeared like sudden sunlight through clouds, suggesting that fragments of self persisted long after expression faltered.
In contrast to these declines, the study of savant syndrome revealed extraordinary pockets of brilliance emerging from atypical neural patterns. Some individuals with severe developmental differences displayed astonishing abilities: flawless musical recall, calendar calculation, artistic precision, or spatial reasoning, despite lacking typical cognitive skills. These abilities suggested that consciousness could manifest in diverse configurations, with certain circuits enhanced while others remained undeveloped. The existence of such prodigious talents within neurologically unique individuals challenged assumptions about normality, intelligence, and the structure of conscious experience, hinting that hidden potentials lay dormant in every mind, accessible only under unusual conditions. As the scientific community explored such extremes, interest deepened in the subtleties of everyday consciousness, moments too fleeting to capture with introspection alone. Micro-expressions, those rapid facial movements lasting only fractions of a second, reflected emotional states that individuals often remained unaware of. Implicit biases shaped decisions without entering conscious thought. Automatic behaviors, like driving familiar routes, unfolded with barely any awareness until something unusual occurred. These phenomena revealed that consciousness represented only a small portion of mental activity, with vast undercurrents operating silently beneath the threshold of awareness. Yet these undercurrents guided behavior with remarkable efficiency, suggesting that consciousness was not a master controller, but more like a commentator overseeing a bustling internal city whose citizens worked tirelessly beyond its view. And still, even as the study of consciousness advanced through countless methods, philosophical reasoning, brain imaging, computational modeling, anthropological inquiry, developmental observation, and clinical analysis, the phenomenon retained an element of the ineffable. Whether contemplating the flicker of awareness in a newborn's eyes, the tranquil depth of a meditative sage, the disorientation of a brain-injured patient, or the surreal coherence of a vivid dream, researchers felt the boundaries of explanation pressing against a horizon that receded with each step forward. Consciousness, it seemed, was both the lens through which the world was viewed and the mystery hiding behind the lens. Yet, even as the horizon receded, new disciplines stepped forward to illuminate corners of consciousness previously untouched. Chronobiologists, studying the deep rhythms that governed life, uncovered patterns suggesting that awareness ebbed and flowed with cycles older than civilization itself. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, a cluster of neurons no larger than a grain of rice, orchestrated circadian rhythms that determined when humans felt alert, reflective, dream-filled, or diffused in thought. These internal clocks synchronized with sunlight, temperature, meal times, and seasons, weaving consciousness into the Earth's rotational and orbital patterns. In Arctic regions, where winter darkness lingered for months, people experienced shifts in mood and awareness that mirrored ancient patterns of survival. In equatorial lands, where day and night remained balanced, a different tempo shaped lives, one reflected in rituals, music, and storytelling. These findings suggested that consciousness was not merely a momentary mental state, but a continuously evolving waveform shaped by celestial mechanics as much as by neural architecture. Meanwhile, social neuroscientists uncovered the extraordinary extent to which consciousness was sculpted by interactions with others. Mirror neurons, discovered almost accidentally in the brains of macaque monkeys, responded not only when an individual performed an action, but when observing another perform the same action. This mirroring capacity hinted at a neurological foundation for empathy, imitation, and social learning. In humans, similar systems allowed individuals to internalize the emotions, intentions, and even postures of those around them, sometimes without conscious awareness. A smile triggered subtle activation patterns in the observer's brain. A yawn leapt across a room like an invisible contagion. Grief resonated through communities like a shared vibration. These effects suggested that consciousness was partly communal, shaped by resonance with others, as if each mind were a string on a vast instrument tuned by millions of neighboring strings. The solitary self, long championed in Western philosophy, appeared increasingly porous, influenced by networks of social signals that wove individuals into shared experiential webs. Cultural neuroscientists extended this insight, revealing that language, traditions, and social norms created distinctive patterns of neural activation. Speakers of tonal languages exhibited enhanced auditory processing. Individuals from collectivist cultures displayed different patterns of self-referential activation than those from individualist societies. People who grew up reading alphabets scanned visual fields differently from those who read character systems. These differences demonstrated that consciousness was not a uniform human phenomenon, but a constellation of culturally shaped experiences. Even perception varied. In some cultures, people focused on central objects while ignoring context. In others, context dominated interpretation. This divergence suggested that consciousness, far from being universal, reflected layered histories of environment, technology, narrative, and value, reminding researchers that the human mind was as diverse as the landscapes and languages that nurtured it. As empirical methods advanced, philosophers continued probing the conceptual foundations of consciousness, proposing thought experiments that tested the boundaries of intuition. The Chinese room argued that syntactic manipulation did not equal semantic understanding. Philosophical zombies raised questions about creatures identical to humans in behavior, but devoid of experience. The Mary's room analogy challenged the relationship between physical information and subjective knowledge. These puzzles served as intellectual crucibles in which assumptions were melted down, distilled, and reformed. Each scenario stretched the imagination into realms where common sense faltered, revealing that the mystery of consciousness extended beyond empirical description into logical terrain where definitions grew slippery and paradoxes proliferated. Interdisciplinary scholars suggested that consciousness might require a synthesis of multiple perspectives: biological, computational, phenomenological, cultural, environmental, none sufficient in isolation. The brain's architecture provided the substrate, but the emergence of conscious experience required dynamics and interactions that spanned levels from molecular to social. Like a symphony dependent not only on instruments, but on the acoustics of the hall, the interpretations of the musicians, and the shared history of music itself. Consciousness required a vast interplay of elements that no single discipline could fully encompass. Such complexity, rather than discouraging inquiry, invigorated it, inspiring new fields like neurophenomenology, which sought to integrate subjective first-person reports with objective third-person measurements, bridging experiential and empirical approaches in ways unimagined a century earlier. Yet among the most humbling discoveries of the modern era was the realization that consciousness could flicker on and off in ways that defied intuition. Anesthesia provided one model, sleep another, but a growing body of research revealed microstates, brief intervals of unconsciousness lasting fractions of a second, occurring even during wakefulness. These microstates represented transitions between neural configurations, fleeting yet ubiquitous, interwoven with cognition so seamlessly that individuals never noticed their own periodic vanishings. Consciousness, in this sense, resembled a lighthouse beam sweeping across the ocean, illuminating only certain regions at any moment while leaving others in darkness. The stability people felt was itself a constructed illusion, maintained by the brain's skillful stitching of disparate moments into a fluid narrative. Parallel to these discoveries, studies of creativity unearthed surprising relationships between unconscious processing and conscious insight. Many breakthroughs, mathematical proofs, artistic innovations, scientific revelations emerged not while individuals were intensely focused, but during relaxation, dreaming, or mundane tasks. The unconscious mind, it seemed, worked tirelessly beneath awareness, weaving associations and recombining ideas until a solution rose up with sudden clarity. This phenomenon echoed ancient accounts of inspiration, from the muses of Greek mythology to the poetic daemons of the Near East. But now research provided neural explanations. During diffuse rest states, neural networks that rarely connected during focused work exchanged information freely, allowing patterns to form that consciousness alone could not anticipate. Insight was not a bolt from the divine, but the surfacing of hidden mental processes into awareness, arriving with a sense of inevitability that masked the complexity of their formation. In laboratories where researchers studied time perception, experiments revealed that consciousness distorted temporal experience in profound ways. Moments of fear stretched seconds into what felt like minutes. States of flow erased hours. Boredom elongated time into a slow-moving haze. Neural models suggested that time consciousness emerged from the brain's capacity to track change, with rapid or intense changes creating the illusion of expanded duration and seamless, predictable flow, compressing subjective time. This insight cast historical narratives of mystical time, dreamlike time, and transcendental timelessness in a new light, suggesting that human ancestors who spoke of eternity or suspended time had intuited psychological truths long before neuroscience formalized them.
Meanwhile, investigations into moral consciousness uncovered layers of judgment and intuition, shaped both by evolution and cultural learning. Studies showed that individuals judged moral dilemmas differently depending on emotional activation, cognitive load, or linguistic framing. The infamous trolley problem revealed tensions between utilitarian reasoning and visceral aversion to harming others directly. Brain imaging demonstrated that moral decisions activated networks related to empathy, prediction, and social cognition, suggesting that morality was not merely a rational construct, but an interplay of instinct, reasoning, and emotional resonance. Historical accounts of shifting moral vistas, from intertribal ethics to universal human rights, reflected expanding circles of conscious concern, shaped by communication, migration, and shared narratives. All the while, computational models continued evolving, predicting that consciousness might be linked to the brain's capacity to compress information into manageable forms. According to these theories, the brain distilled complex sensory data into simplified representations that preserved essential information while discarding irrelevant detail. Consciousness in this framework was the experience associated with the highest levels of this compression, the point where meaning crystallized out of complexity. Such models paralleled historical patterns in human storytelling, where cultures distilled collective experiences into myths, symbols, and narratives adapted across generations. Yet for every theory claiming to capture the essence of consciousness, counterexamples emerged that resisted reduction. Individuals with vast cortical damage maintained surprising degrees of awareness. Patients with fully intact brains displayed disorders of self-recognition or dissociation. People experienced hallucinations indistinguishable from reality during sensory deprivation. Consciousness appeared not as one capacity, but as a constellation of functions that sometimes dissociated, sometimes recombined in unexpected ways. This diversity mirrored the multiplicity seen across cultures, species, and individuals, suggesting that the phenomenon humanity sought to understand might not be one thing, but many. And still the narrative pressed forward through laboratories, rituals, philosophies, simulations, dreams, histories, through every attempt humanity had ever made to approach the luminous enigma at the core of its existence. Consciousness remained the shimmering thread binding experience into continuity, the silent witness beneath every perception,
the explorer facing the uncharted terrain of inner and outer worlds with equal mystery.